Welcome to Out of Zion with Susan Michael, an exploration of the Bible and the land of Israel. From ancient biblical sites to the story behind the stories, join Susan on a journey through the most exciting book on the planet. Hit the subscribe button for future episodes, which will deepen your faith and bring the Bible to life. And now, here's our host, Susan Michael.
Well, hey there, and welcome to our Going Deeper episode this week. We are so excited to have with us today Dr. Chris McKinny, who is an archaeologist and an expert in the realm of the Israelites' exit from Egypt. They're wandering in the desert, the tabernacle. We're going to talk about a lot of these really interesting things that we've been reading about in our walk through the Bible. So welcome, and let's get started. So, Dr. Chris McKinny, I'm going to address you as Chris, but I want to emphasize your amazing background. You have a PhD from Bar-Ilan University, and you have a master's degree from Bar-Ilan and another master's from the Jerusalem University College, where I also attended, although many years earlier than you did. And I know you're an adjunct faculty member of several universities, and I appreciate you're also an ordained minister and involved in church leadership. And, you know, I have here your 16-page CV of all your archaeological experience and all the papers and scholarly works that you've written and co-edited. And it's just so impressive, and we are so appreciative of you giving of your time today to be with us. So a warm welcome to you.
Thank you very much, Susan. And it's my pleasure to be on the podcast and to offer any insight to what I consider just to be a fascinating section of the Bible.
I would like to talk about, though, now about the tabernacle. And I find the story so fascinating that God calls Moses up to the mountain, and he proposes to his people a covenant, what I liken to a marriage. And and they say, yes, we'll do everything the Lord says. So it's like, okay, we're going to seal the deal. And he gives the 10 Commandments. And then the next thing is he tells them how to build this tabernacle so that God can come down off the mountain and dwell amongst his people. And this is what sets him apart from all the other ideas of gods that were, you know, way out there. They couldn't be touched. They couldn't be really known. And here the God of the Israelites wanted to be known. He wanted to dwell with his people. So share with us about the tabernacle. I know it does have some similarities to other buildings in the region, and none of that bothers me. God was speaking to his people within their cultural context, but explain to us about the tabernacle.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the tabernacle in some ways it's kind of just another part of this grand sweep of the Exodus event that is. If you don't have the tabernacle, you're kind of left with a salvation without sanctification, if you will. You're not, and really that's what the tabernacle is about. It's about sanctification. It's about making holy. You know, God is holy, and you have to come into his presence in a correct way. And so when we talk about the tabernacle, I think one of the first things is everything you said I completely agree with. And as it happens, one of the things that we're doing with Gesher is developing products, and particularly a documentary that will be about this very topic, where we're going to be interviewing a number of scholars talking about the tabernacle. And it's something that we're really excited about. Hopefully it will be out in the who knows? We have a release date, but we're really excited about this very idea. And so whenever I talk about the tabernacle, I think one of the most interesting things about it is to go to its predecessor. And its predecessor, I would say, is actually in the Garden of Eden. Because if we think of the tabernacle and its features, we have a structure that has really three main parts. It has a courtyard, it has a holy place, and the most holy place, sometimes called the Holy of Holies. And these three parts are a set of sacred space that include a number of utensils. Now, the courtyard itself, on the outside, it has the bronze altar, the sacrificial altar. It has a bronze laver or a wash basin, which is important for the priests to sanctify and purify themselves with, as well as washing utensils. As you would enter in through the first veil of the tabernacle, you would encounter other utensils. The bread of the presence on your right, or the table of the showbread. On your left, you would have what's called the menorah or the lampstand, which is styled after to look like a tree. It has all of these vegetation characteristics. And then you would have, of course, the altar of incense, where you have incense burning. We have all these descriptions in Exodus describing just the right type of incense you need to be holy. And then directly right in front of you, you have the next veil, which has the cherubim on it. These, what I would call divine throne wardens, with their wings guarding the way into God's most sacred space. And of course, if you were to go in there, if you were the high priest, or if you go to Israel and visit Timnah, you can see what that would look like, or at least a reconstruction. You would of course find the Ark of the Covenant, which is a two-part item, the chest, which includes the 2 stone tablets, and the jar of manna, as well as Aaron's staff. And then the mercy seat, which again has these 2 cherubim figures. And most people don't usually think of this, but also, and it's very clear in Exodus, the very presence of God, not just symbolically, but physically there in the form of the pillar of fire and cloud, depending on what time of day or night it was. Now, so just giving that like broader perspective, and obviously we could say much more about how this plays a role in Exodus and Leviticus. We have everything you're supposed to do in terms of sacrifice. But let's think about each one of those features as we go back in time to think about the Garden of Eden. The Garden of Eden, of course, with Adam and later she's called Eve in the story, who are created. They're placed in a location where God is. And so this is a divine sacred space. They, of course, are provided for. They are given food they can eat from. Most especially, we're told that they can eat from the tree of life. Well, in my opinion, and many would agree with me, that the menorah itself is likely styled after the idea of the tree of life. That it is a place where you have God's presence, and it's symbolic of what is there. And this is kind of our first hint as to what the tabernacle it might be modeled off of. In fact, if we fast forward in the Bible to the book of Hebrews, we learn that Moses is actually given a vision of what he saw on the mountain of the real thing. And so he actually is given what was actually in God's court, what I like to call the room where it happens. This same place where Isaiah in Isaiah chapter 6, says, "Woe is me, I'm a man of unclean lips," where Ezekiel has, the vision of the wheel within the wheel as it's in the Jerusalem temple. And we have John and Daniel all doing the same thing. And so he's given this vision, and he said, "Make a copy of what you see, and I'll instruct you as well as these workmen, Bezalel and Oholiab, to make these items." And so one of those features is the tree of life, which I think is connected with the menorah. But the other thing is the table of showbread is a symbolic element that shows that Adam and Eve could have eaten from any of the food that was all available to them, except, of course, the one tree they weren't supposed to. And so if we apply that to the tabernacle, we have the consecrated, those made righteous and representative for the people, which, of course, is the priesthood, who share in this meal with God, who share in his presence, and they're provided for, which they also function as an intermediary role for the people that remain unable to because of sin, because of what of course happened in Eden. And so as you go further, of course, you have the altar of incense, which represents the idea of God's, the smell that God has in this aroma. But I would say one of the most important connections is the Ark of the Covenant itself, because the Ark of the Covenant represents God's presence, his physical presence in the tabernacle. And that also is representative of what you have going on in Genesis 2 and 3, where God is walking among them. And the most obvious connection is actually after the fall and after the curse is given, where we have Adam and Eve driven away from the access to the tree of life. And what we actually have is an angel or a cherubim set up with a flaming sword guarding the entrance to Eden and to the tree of life, and God stationing him there to protect man from having access to the tree of life. Well, if you plot that on the tabernacle, which also gets repeated, of course, in the Solomonic temple, you have almost exactly the same thing, where God's presence has these tiers of access to, because of the nature of sin, because of the nature that man has to come in God's presence. It has to go through all of these steps to become clean and righteous and holy before they can come into God's presence. And so what we see then is that the tabernacle is that all-important step to begin the process where we can get back to Eden, where you can have mankind, man and woman made in the image of God, coming back into his presence. And that's actually another really interesting thing as well. The tabernacle itself doesn't, of course, or I should say the Ark of the Covenant doesn't have a image. Now you might say, well, it does have the cherubim, which of course are images. They are most likely meant to depict people with wings, although some people think they may have been lions and that type of thing. But they're most likely angelic, divine beings, but they're not the object of worship. The object of worship is an invisible, although sometimes visible in the form of pillar of fire and pillar of cloud, but there is no image. If you went to any other Egyptian or Canaanite or Mesopotamian temple, what you would find, of course, is a wooden, usually covered with metal, precious metal idol that depicts the deity. Now, even they didn't think that was the full deity. They thought it was the symbol of that deity. It reflected their power on earth. Now, what's so interesting is that we have the same terminology of being an image compared to people. In other words, if we think of the way that we are created, we are made in the image of God to be reflective of his glory in the same way that the pagan mind considered how idols were meant to reflect the divine deities that they worshipped. So someone reading that in that context would immediately make that connection. Now, that's harder for us living in the 21st century without, walking down the street, like if you're an Israelite growing up in Egypt and you pass all these temples. In fact, you even see these metal gods, these idols going on display. But to say that we are made in the image of God, as it is in the Edenic temple, as it's sometimes called, is very, very important to make those connections. So that's the first thing I'd say, is that when we think of the tabernacle, its construction, it really is at its basis a return back to what Eden was all about. But as you kind of hinted at, it doesn't just, God gives instructions, but they're not starting at, let's say, ground zero. They're not going to be able to make a one-for-one build of the tabernacle and the Ark of the Covenant without some cultural context. And so if you've read through Exodus, you actually have the instructions twice. I read it through recently with my boys, and I got them to pay attention better when I called these as kind of like the Lego instructions. The Lego instructions on how to build the ark and the tabernacle and so on. And actually the reason why we have it twice is because one is in the first giving of the covenant, which is already broken because they have the golden calf episode. And then the second part is giving it again, but as they're building it and as it's becoming completed. And so there's been a number of really important studies over the years that archaeology has heavily contributed to. The single most important discovery is really one of the most well-known discoveries, and that is King Tut's tomb, or Tutankhamun. It was the only tomb that was not looted in antiquity. And as I always like to say, King Tuts was really an unimportant figure. I mean, he died at the age of 19, and his tomb is actually much smaller than many of the others of his forebearers and people that followed him. And it's only really because his tomb was so small and accidentally was not discovered in antiquity that we have it. But from the amazing wealth that was in there, one can only imagine what Tutmos III or Ramses would have had. But even with just this kind of really unimportant pharaoh that we all know because of the discovery, we see just the absolute wealth of Egypt. And one of the most important features that was found in his tomb was what's called the Anubis chest. Anubis is a jackal deity in ancient Egypt, but it is what this is it's a box that holds holy objects, and it has a figure on top of it, the figure of Anubis, and it also is overlaid with gold. It's made, I believe, from acacia wood, and it is connected with poles that are overlaid with gold. And one of the really interesting things is because scholars have often noted that if you put the rings for the poles on the side, as it's often depicted, even in the movies with Indiana Jones, for instance, it wouldn't work well because it would just fall right off. So they actually have the poles running under the feet or running right underneath the main part of the chest. And so that's one of the ways which we can now most likely reconstruct how the ark would have worked, but not just in terms of the build, but in terms of also its function. It held holy objects. Inside of it were important objects, perhaps even some of the canopic jars and things of that nature were held in that to help, in this case, King Tut in the afterlife. And so that's just one object. There's others as well. There's an excellent book that I can point your listeners to that was just published this past year by an Egyptologist named David Falk, I think it's called The Ark of the Covenant in its Egyptian Context. Very well illustrated, very well written, with, I think, 100 or so photos, where he makes the case that the Ark of the Covenant really is heavily influenced by New Kingdom Egypt. Of course, there's the example I just gave of the Anubis chest, but we have other things such as mobile thrones, or what's called palanquins, which would have some of these objects, including winged figures on them that would carry kings as well as carry other figures. We have these or I should say these ships, or they're called barks, that have a shrine on top of them that would carry the god, the small idol, from one part of the temple to actually go on display and be brought and placed inside of the Holy of Holies. And so all of these things, that's not to say a one-to-one between the Ark of the Covenant and something exactly you have in Egyptian culture, but there's so many parallels that you see that the people who made the Ark of the Covenant, Bezalel and Oholiab, the two craftsmen that are mentioned, are using the same ideas that we have coming out of Egypt. It's very difficult to look at what you have in King Tut's tomb and what you see there and not see some similarities. And yet that's what many biblical scholars have to do, because they want to say that a book like Exodus dates to a much later period. And so David Falk has done a great service in showing that these parallels that exist between the book of Exodus and I should say that the Exodus description of the Ark of the Covenant and what you see in Egypt really can only be dated to the New Kingdom. And again, that's 1550 to about 1150 BC. After it, you have a major shift, a major change. And so that's one element. But the Egyptian parallels don't really end there. In fact, in my opinion, one of the most fascinating ones goes back to the guy we talked about earlier with Ramses II. And on those same reliefs, which I talked about at the Battle of Kadesh, we have two of these that are preserved. The best one is at a place in southern Egypt called Abu Simbel. Way up in the top of his temple, he has on this battle relief, he has a picture of his war tent in a plan view, as if you were, a bird looking down, bird's eye view. And he has a courtyard, a wide, rectangular courtyard with shields around it. He has his forces all around this courtyard. And in the midst of this courtyard, seemingly to be east-oriented, he has another smaller rectangular structure, which has worshipers bowing down to it. And at the very back, in the innermost part of this, he has a separate room. And in that room, he has a cartouche, which for Egyptians, that's basically a small oval, which has the name usually of the pharaoh. And on this cartouche is his name. And on both sides of this cartouche, we have two winged figures with their wings pointing up, looking at it. And you look at this and you say, this is the tabernacle. This is exactly what the tabernacle looked like. And this was the function of the tabernacle. And so what it actually is in the relief is a war tent where you have Ramses' own tent that he is camping in among his fighting men as he goes to the battle to fight with them. And so if we think of that as what God is building, where God is empowering and inspiring Bezalel and Oholiab through the instruction of Moses to build, is more or less the same thing. It is a war tent where he, as their warrior king, is residing above these throne wardens, these cherubim, and he is communicating and oftentimes giving instructions on how to fight the enemies. We can see this with Sihon, king of the Amorites. When they go there, Moses goes before him and he asks, okay, what should we do? And he tells him, this is what you're supposed to do. Same thing with Og. When the mantle gets passed to Joshua, same idea. He sees the commander of Yahweh's host and he gives him the information. This is what you do to fight the battle. And so we have here again the idea that God is a much better version of what Pharaoh claims to be. And when they have the using of this warrior tent shrine to have the tabernacle in it. Now, that's not to say there aren't innovations. Of course, there are. We don't have other gods present. There's only one God that is present. We have the commandments, or I should say the covenant, placed inside of the tabernacle. We have these other features, but the parallels are really striking once you see the visuals. Now, another person I would point your readers to is a scholar named Joshua Berman out of Bar Ilan University, who has made a lot of these suggestions and built on a lot of these ideas as well. Now, one last thing before we move on. One of the really interesting things as well is what's inside of the Ark of the Covenant. Now, most people will remember, of course, the jar of manna and Aaron's staff that budded. But the other thing is, of course, the tablets. Now, in every depiction we have of those stone tablets, what do we have on there? On one tablet, it's the first five commandments. And on the other tablet, it's the other five commandments. One is associated with how you're to relate to God. The other one's to be how you're supposed to associate, with your neighbor and others. But if you look in your Bible, it never says that. It never says that, the tablets are meant to just only have the Ten Commandments. In fact, if they're doing that, it's a gross use of writing space, because these things were probably quite large. And we know from this very period that the idea of a covenant was ratified through these treaties, and especially the idea of a what's called a vassal suzerain treaty, where you have a great king who is going to make treaties with a lesser people. And this is mostly connected with the kingdom of the Hittites. And we have a lot of these that were discovered in Turkey, thankfully, because most of their archive was intact. And we can find many of the same features that appear in the book of Deuteronomy, such as the long historical prologue, the blessings and the cursings that we have in Deuteronomy, which have direct parallels to what you see in these Hittite treaties. And one of the features that I really want to point out is what they would often do in these treaties is at the very end, they would say, okay, you agree to all these, and if you don't, this is going to happen to you. You will be cursed. That's the blessing and cursing side. And then we both agree to it. You take one copy and deposit it in your temple. I'll take one copy and deposit it in my temple. So it's on really public display, but in a divine space that the gods are called to bear, that you make sure you keep up your end of the bargain. So that's a way that they were trying to make sure that this covenant, this treaty would stay intact. Well, most likely what you have then, if the Bible, if the Exodus covenant can be connected with this, which I think makes really good sense. Kenneth Kitchen, for instance, very well-known Egyptologist. I like to say he has magnum opuses. He has just a huge amount of text that he's translated over the years. But one of the main things he did is compare all the different treaties of the second and first millennium, and then made the point that I just made. So if that's true, that what we have on these tablets is a treaty that is the treaty between the God of Israel and Israel itself, then it would make sense that both copies would actually be duplicates, and they would be both placed inside of the main shrine and warrior tent, both of the overlord, that would be God as the king of Israel, as well as his vassals, which would be Israel itself. And so it's placed inside of this chest, much in the same way that we saw with Egyptian chest, where they hold these very important pieces of information. And so when they carry this from place to place, they're carrying not only the idea that God's going before them, they're bringing with them also this covenant that they're going to, of course, ratify later on when they get to the land. So a lot of really interesting connections that great theologians that have gone had no access to because archaeology hadn't been developed yet. The Hattusa, the capital of the Hittites, had never been excavated. And so we can see more and more of these parallels that I don't like to use the word prove the Bible, but actually help us understand what these connections really are and actually tease out new ways of interpreting it that get us much closer to the original understanding of the original author and the original audience.
Yes, and I just want to mention, one of the things that people use if they want to debunk the Bible, and I always bring this up because I want to give our listeners answers so that they can respond to some of these things. And so one of the things is that, it's not unique that there were these same elements in Egypt or in the culture at the time. So you've given us a great example there with the Ark of the Covenant, the Tabernacle. But for me, I think it's the flip side. Actually, it shows me how accurate the Bible is because it's rightly reflecting of the time and the culture. So if
Right.
God were to have come to them 3,500 years ago in the wilderness and said, okay, I want you to build a tabernacle. Now go lay your concrete foundation and then get your wood frame. I'm going to be like, that's
Right.
just totally foreign. You can tell that was written later and put in.
Right.
But this was not. This is very, very accurate of something that they were familiar with. But I love the way you describe the connection back to the Garden of Eden. And that what God intended all along was to have this space whereby he fellowshiped with man. And due to our sin, we lost that space. But his goal always was and still is to get mankind back to that space and get us back into fellowship with him. And the tabernacle, all of these beautiful things that you described, were later then just put into the permanent temple. And it was like a spiritual reality carried from Eden to the tabernacle to the temple and into the body of Christ today. And what we have to look forward to when heaven comes to earth, we have new heaven and new earth. I mean, that's where God is headed. So it's really beautiful. And so we just want to thank you for sharing with us from such a place of knowledge and of expertise, and to share with us your excitement over the Bible and over the stories and the accuracy of it. So we just want to thank you for giving of your time and sharing with us today. And once again, we link in the show notes to the Gesher Media project that he referred to. And as soon as you have your documentary done, Chris, please come back and talk to us further about the tabernacle and the temple, as you'll be covering it in this documentary. So thank you. Thank everyone for joining us. See you back in a few days for Walk Through the Bible. And until then, God bless.
We hope you have enjoyed this episode of Out of Zion with Susan Michael. Be sure to subscribe to Out of Zion now on Apple Podcasts, cpnshows.com, YouTube, or wherever you like to listen and learn. Out of Zion with Susan Michael is a production of ICEJ USA, all rights reserved.